The ink was barely dry on the church register when Clara Whitfield understood the precise nature of what she had done. The preacher had closed his Bible before the echo of the vows left the raftered ceiling, and the handful of witnesses, old Mrs. Denny from the boarding house, a ranch hand she did not recognize, and the town clerk who doubled as notary, had already begun filing toward the door as though they were embarrassed to have witnessed the transaction at all. That was the correct word for it. Transaction, not a wedding, not a beginning, a settlement of accounts. Hers were simple enough. $31 of debt at the mercantile, a room she could no longer afford after the first of the month, and no living kin within 400 miles who would claim her. His were harder to read. Elias Crane stood at the altar the way a man stands before a judge, straight-backed, arms at his sides, expression closed as a locked drawer. He had signed the register with the same economy he seemed to apply to everything. 2 strokes. A line beneath. Done. Clara pulled her gloves on one finger at a time and did not look at him. The church was cold for October. Her breath made small clouds in the air before her face, and the wooden pew she had sat in for the brief ceremony had left a chill through the thin wool of her dress. She had worn the gray one, not the black which still smelled of her first husband's funeral 4 years past and which she could not bring herself to alter, and not the blue, which was too fine for a mourning that deserved nothing fine. The gray was honest. It asked for nothing. "Wagons outside," Elias Crane said. He did not offer his hand. She did not wait for him to. The road from Harlan Creek to the Crane Ranch stretched 11 miles of packed red dirt and patchy scrub grass, and he drove it without a word. The horse, a sturdy bay gelding that needed no instruction, moved at a steady pace while the flat plains opened around them like something indifferent to human arrangement. Clara held her traveling case in her lap and watched the country. She had been in Harlan Creek for 6 months, long enough to learn that the land here did not soften. It simply persisted. She respected that, even when she did not like it. Elias Crane's profile was sharp against the pale sky. He was older than she had expected, perhaps 40, perhaps a little past it, with the kind of weathered face that came not from age alone but from sustained labor under sun and wind. His jaw was set. His hands on the reins were unhurried. He wore a hat she suspected he slept in, and his coat was clean but mended at one cuff, the thread a shade lighter than the original fabric, the kind of repair a man makes himself when he has no one to ask. She noted this without sentiment. "The house," he said, when they were perhaps 4 miles out, "has 2 bedrooms. You'll have the one on the east side. The door has a latch." "I understand. There's a woman who comes Fridays to help with washing. Margaret Holt. You don't need to direct her. She knows the house." "All right." A silence. The wagon wheel found a rut and climbed out of it. "I'm not looking for a wife," he said. "What I mean is, I needed someone who could manage the books in the house while I managed the herd. We had an agreement with Fowler's Bank come due in December. I needed a legal signature on a refinancing document. A wife's signature holds where a hired hand's does not." Clara turned her head and looked at him directly for the first time since the church. "And I needed the debt cleared and a roof that is not conditional on the goodwill of a landlord who has already told me I am surplus to his requirements," she said. "We each had our reasons. I don't expect you to pretend otherwise." He looked at her then. It was brief. She could not have said what moved across his expression in that moment, but it was not unkindness. "No," he said, "I won't." The ranch appeared at the end of a long, shallow rise, and it looked exactly like what it was, a dying operation held together by desperation and pride. The main house was gray-weathered timber, 2 stories, with a front porch that sagged on the left side where a post had shifted and not been corrected. A barn stood to the east, red paint fading to rust. There were 3 outbuildings of descending size and one she could not identify, its function apparent only from the smell that reached her on the wind. Horses, dung, wet straw, the particular sharpness of animals kept in closed quarters through cold nights. A windmill turned without urgency at the back edge of the yard. 2 ranch hands watched the wagon approach from the fence line and did not wave. Clara took a slow breath. She had survived worse arrivals. Inside, the house was dim and smelled of wood smoke, and the faint remnant of food cooked that morning. Beans, she thought, and coffee grounds. The furniture was heavy and old, selected for durability rather than comfort. The kitchen was large and practical, with an iron stove that showed long use and a table of sanded oak scarred by years of meals and ledger work. The windows were small, the curtains were absent. A black and white dog came from beneath the table and regarded her without enthusiasm. "That's Hector," Elias said, setting her case down without ceremony near the foot of the stairs. "He doesn't warm up fast." "Neither do I," Clara said. She did not know why she said it. It was true, but it was more than she had intended to give. She crossed to the kitchen window and looked out at the yard, at the angle of the mid-morning light on the dirt, at the fence that needed the third rail replaced. The windmill turned. A hawk crossed the sky in one long diagonal and was gone. Behind her, she heard Elias Crane remove his hat, set it on the table, and sit down with the weight of a man who carries more than the morning has given him. She did not turn around. There were rules to surviving a situation like this, and Clara had learned most of them the hard way, in the years after Thomas Whitfield had left her a widow with a fine name, a fine coffin bill, and nothing else. Rule 1. Earn your place before you claim it. Rule 2. Never show the full extent of what you know in the first week. Rule 3. Do not need anything you cannot acquire for yourself. She set her case on the stairs, smoothed the front of her gray dress, and turned around. "Show me the ledgers," she said. Elias looked up. The dog looked up. Something shifted in the kitchen air, not warmth, nothing so generous as that, but a subtle adjustment, the beginning of a recalibration. He went to the sideboard without argument, produced a leather-bound ledger worn soft at the corners, and set it on the table. Then he went outside without saying another word, and Clara sat down, opened the book, and began to read. The numbers told the story more plainly than any man in Harlan Creek had dared to tell her. The Crane Ranch, registered as Crane and Son, a name that referred to a son who was apparently no longer present, though she did not yet know why, had been solvent 3 years prior. Cattle prices, a drought season, and a series of maintenance costs that had been deferred until they became emergencies had done their work steadily and without mercy. The banknote to Fowler's First Territorial was not merely large. It was, without intervention, unsurvivable. A second lien had been placed on 40 acres of the eastern pasture by a man named Aldous Vetch. The name appeared twice in the margins, in different ink, one note in a hand she did not recognize. She wrote the name on a blank page at the back of the ledger and underlined it. Outside, she could hear Elias Crane giving instructions to his hands in a voice that did not rise. She could not make out the words. She did not need to. The voice alone told her the shape of the man, controlled, accustomed to being obeyed, and trying very hard not to show how close to the edge of something he was standing. She turned to the expense columns and began to annotate. By the time the light through the small kitchen window had shifted to noon's flat brightness, she had found 3 redundancies in the supply ordering, 1 vendor overcharge that had been repeated unchallenged for 11 months, and a tax notation that, if the county assessment records were what she thought they were, suggested Crane had been overpaying on the eastern acreage since the original boundary survey of 1878. She did not know the assessment records were wrong. She would need to see the documents. But the figure was wrong in a way that looked like someone else's error rather than his. She closed the ledger. She went to the stove, checked the state of the firebox, found it low, and added 2 lengths of wood from the stack beside it. She found flour, lard, and a cold skillet. She found salt and a half jar of dried rosemary. She did not know the kitchen yet, but she knew kitchens, and this one, like all the rest, had its logic once you learned to ask it the right questions. When Elias Crane came in at noon, there was bread on the table, a bowl of heated beans from the pot she had found at the back of the stove, and the ledger sitting closed beside his coffee cup with a single page of her handwritten notes folded into the cover. He looked at the table. He looked at the notes. He did not open them immediately. He washed his hands at the basin, dried them on the rough towel hanging from the stove handle, and sat down. He opened the notes. Clara stood at the window with her own cup of coffee and did not look at him. She counted the fence posts she could see from here, 14, then a gap where 1 was missing, then 5 more before the line turned. She would note that too. Not today, but soon. Behind her, the only sound in the kitchen was the turning of her handwritten page. Then, very quietly, he said, "The Vetch lien, I saw it. He put that on the books in March, claimed my father owed him for a water diversion he built on the South Creek boundary. I don't have record of any agreement. Is there a written contract? Silence. That would be no, she said. I've been paying against it because he threatened to file a formal claim with the county clerk, and I didn't want the attention while the banknote was unresolved. Clara turned from the window and looked at him. He was still looking at the page, not at her. That was a mistake, she said, not unkindly. He set the page down. I know it was. If there is no written agreement, the lien has no legal standing under territorial property statute. Payments made against an uncontested, unlawful lien can be recovered. Partially. Not in full, but enough to matter. Now he looked at her. She held his gaze without performance. Where did you learn that? He said. My first husband was a lawyer, she said. A poor one, in the end. But I kept his books and read his library, and the two together were more useful than either alone. He looked at her for a long moment. Not with warmth, that was not a word that had any place in this kitchen yet, but with something she recognized as rarer and, to her, more valuable. He was reassessing. She could see it happening, the small recalibration behind the eyes, the way a man looks when he finds something where he expected nothing. He picked up his coffee. He looked back at the notes. I'll need to see the county records, she said. I can take you to town Thursday. That will do. She sat down across from him. The bread was still warm. Outside, the wind moved through the yard in a long, low pass, and the loose shutter on the north side of the house knocked once and was still. Hector came from beneath the stove and lay down between them with the philosophical resignation of a creature that has seen arrangements come and go and learned not to invest too early. Clara cut the bread. She set a piece beside his bowl without comment. He ate it without comment. That was the first meal. It was not comfortable. It was not warm. It was not anything she would have chosen. But it was honest. And on the Crane Ranch in the autumn of 1883, honest was the only currency that had not yet been spent. 3 days passed in the way that first days on a strange property always do, in the accumulation of small observations rather than large events. Clara learned the house by its sounds before she learned it by its geography. The stove popped twice before it held heat. The third step on the staircase was soft and should not be trusted with full weight. The east bedroom window did not latch unless you lifted the frame slightly before turning the pin, a detail no one had mentioned, and which she discovered at 2 a.m. when the wind came up from the northwest, and the glass began to rattle in its casing like something trying to get in. She fixed it herself. She did not mention it. The ranch hands were 2, a lean young man named Cord, who could not have been more than 22, and who looked at her with the cautious curiosity of someone who had been warned to be careful, and an older hand called Burris, whose face was a map of every season he had survived, and who looked at her with no expression at all, which she found more comfortable than the alternative. Neither of them spoke to her directly in those first 3 days. They nodded when she passed. They took their meals at the bunkhouse. The arrangement was clear enough. She was a new and uncertain quantity, and they were waiting to see what she amounted to before they spent any goodwill on her. That was fair. She applied the same logic to them. Elias Crane himself was a man of strict and legible routines. He rose before first light. She knew this because the stove in the kitchen was always warm when she came down, the coffee already made, the man himself already gone. He came in at midday for 20 minutes, ate without conversation, and returned to the yard. He came in again at dusk, washed at the basin, sat at the table with whatever problem the day had left him, and was in bed before 9. He did not seek her out. He did not avoid her. He moved around her in the house with the practiced care of a man who has lived alone long enough that another person's presence registers as an inconvenience to be navigated rather than a comfort to be accepted. On the 4th morning, she found the ledger on the table again, open to the supply column, with a single line written in his handwriting at the bottom of the page. Vetch came by yesterday. Said the next payment is due November 1st. Below that, in smaller print, I did not pay him. Clara read it twice. She poured her coffee, sat down, and wrote beneath it, "Good. Do not pay him anything further. I will have the relevant statute citations ready before Thursday." She closed the book and left it where he would find it. That was how they communicated in those early days, in the margins of the ledger, in brief declarative sentences, in the grammar of people who have agreed not to waste each other's time. It was not warmth, but it was, she was beginning to understand, a form of respect. Elias Crane did not explain himself to people. The fact that he explained himself to her, even in 3-line increments, meant something she did not yet allow herself to name. Thursday came with a flat gray sky and the smell of rain that did not arrive. Elias drove her to town in the same silence he had used on their wedding day, and she sat beside him on the wagon bench with her notebook in her lap and watched the land go by. Harlan Creek from the road looked modest and deliberate, a mercantile, a feed store, the church whose cold she still remembered, a bank with freshly painted letters above the door that read, Fowler's First Territorial, in the particular confident font of institutions that intended to outlast the people who owed them money. She felt the weight of that building from 40 feet away. The county clerk's office was a single room attached to the back of the post office, presided over by a narrow man named Elbert Prine, who wore a green eyeshade and regarded all visitors with the same expression of mild inconvenience. Clara asked for the boundary survey records on the Crane property and the adjacent Vetch holdings going back to 1878. Prine looked at her. He looked at Elias, who had come to stand behind her left shoulder without being asked. Prine produced the records. She worked for 40 minutes at the standing table, while Elias leaned against the doorframe and said nothing. She found what she had expected to find. The 1878 survey placed the South Creek boundary 14 feet further east than Vetch's water diversion claim required, which meant the diversion did not cross Crane land at all. The lien was not merely uncontracted, it was geographically fraudulent. She copied the relevant measurements into her notebook in a precise hand, noted the survey registration number, and closed the folder. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pushing dust along the street in long, pale ribbons. Elias walked beside her toward the wagon and did not speak until they reached it. Well, he said. The lien is fraudulent, she said. The diversion does not cross your land. Vetch either knows that and is extorting you, or he had a survey done by someone incompetent. Either way, you have grounds to contest and recover. He put his hand on the wagon side. A muscle in his jaw moved once. I've been paying that man for 8 months, he said. I know. That money came out of the spring calf sales. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see the thing working in him, the particular fury of a proud man who discovers he has been made a fool of, and the separate, harder thing beneath it, which was relief. Someone had found it. Someone had found the fault in the wall he had been throwing money at, and the wall had no right to stand. He looked at her. Not briefly this time. Clara, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She registered it the way you register a shift in temperature, not dramatic, not warm yet, but different from what the air had been a moment before. Don't thank me, she said. It serves neither of us for that money to keep going to Vetch. He almost smiled. Almost. He helped her into the wagon, not with ceremony, simply with a hand offered at the right moment, and she took it without comment, and they drove back to the ranch through the dust-ribboned afternoon, with something between them that had not been there on the road to town. It was not comfort, it was not yet trust, but it was the first thing that felt, if she was honest with herself, like the beginning of one. The rain that had threatened all week finally arrived on Saturday night, not as the gradual build Clara might have expected, but as a hard, flat wall of water that came across the plains without apology and struck the ranch like something that had been waiting. She heard it begin at the roof while she was still at the kitchen table with the ledger open and a candle burning low beside her ink pot. Within 10 minutes, the yard was running with shallow rivers of red mud, and the sound on the tin roof was loud enough that she did not hear Elias come down the stairs until he was already in the kitchen doorway with his boots half laced and his coat over his arm. The east fence line, he said. If that creek comes up the lower pasture floods and we lose the remaining calves, how many hands do you have tonight? Cord's here. Burris rode to his sister's place in town. He was already moving toward the door. Stay inside. She stood up. I can drive the supply wagon to the east barn, she said. If the calves need moving, you'll need a second pair of hands to manage the gate while you push them through. One man cannot do both. He turned and looked at her with an expression that was not argument exactly, but was adjacent to it, the expression of a man whose instinct is to refuse help and whose intelligence is currently fighting that instinct for control. "The mud will be bad," he said. "I have boots." Another pause. A long one. "Stay on the high side of the yard," he said, and went out into the rain. She put on her coat. The next 2 hours dismantled several things Clara had believed about herself and several more she had believed about Elias Crane. She had believed, for instance, that her physical usefulness on a working ranch would be limited to the domestic and the administrative, that she was a woman of ledgers and kitchens, capable enough within those walls, but not built for what lay beyond them. She had driven cattle on her uncle's small property as a girl, but that was 20 years past and in gentler country than this. She had believed that belief about herself so thoroughly that she had almost not recognized the competence when it returned to her hands. She managed the east gate. The calves, 11 of them, frightened and loud and coated in mud to their chests, needed to be pushed from the flooding lower pen to the high barn in 2 groups, and the gate had to be held open and then quickly closed against the fence line water pressure while Cord drove the animals through. She held it, both times. Her arms shook on the second push, but she did not step back, and when the last calf cleared the threshold, she swung the gate hard and dropped the iron pin into its collar and stood there in the rain with her chest heaving and her coat soaked through to the linen underneath. Cord stared at her from across the pen. "Ma'am," he said, with a kind of reverence that embarrassed them both. She waved it off and went to find Elias. He was at the far end of the fence line where a section of post had given way under the water pressure, and the wire was lying flat in the mud, a gap wide enough for an animal to walk through without noticing. He was working alone in the dark with a lantern hung on a fence post and the rain coming sideways, driving replacement stakes with a mallet that made no impression on the sound of the storm, wrestling wet wire with his bare hands because gloves gave you no grip on iron in the wet. Clara took the wire from his left side without asking and held the tension while he drove the connector staple. He looked at her hands on the wire. He did not tell her to let go. They worked the length of it together in silence, her holding, him driving, and when the last stake was set, he straightened up and pushed the soaked hair back from his forehead and looked at the repair with the particular expression of a man assessing whether the thing he has just done will hold. "It'll hold until morning," he said. "Then we'll fix it properly in the morning," she said. He turned and looked at her. The lantern light moved in the wind, and his face was in and out of shadow, but she could see enough. She could see the thing she had not expected to see in him, not gratitude, which would have been ordinary, but something that cost him more to feel. He was looking at her the way a man looks when the world has surprised him in a direction he did not have a defense prepared for. He said nothing. He picked up the mallet and the remaining wire, and they walked back to the house through the diminishing rain, and she was aware of him beside her in the dark in a way she had not been aware of another person in a very long time. Not as a threat, not as an obligation, simply as a presence, solid and real and unexpectedly companionable in the way that shared work makes 2 people companionable before either of them has decided to allow it. In the kitchen, he set the mallet down, and she hung her coat on the peg by the door, and the sound of the rain was softer now, still falling but without its earlier fury, the way strong things settle once they have proven their point. "You held that gate," he said. "It needed holding." He looked at his own hands, red from the wire, mud dark at the knuckles. Then he looked at hers. She did not pull them back. "I'll heat the stove," he said. She sat down at the table and opened the ledger, and did not let herself think about the way her name had been sitting in his mouth since the moment they came through the door, unspoken but present, like a word he had not yet decided whether to spend. The morning after the storm was the kind that makes the plains look newly invented. The sky scrubbed pale blue, the mud drying at the edges, the air carrying the particular cold clarity that follows hard rain in October. Clara was up before Elias, which she had not managed before, and she had the stove lit and the coffee made when she heard his boots on the stairs. He came into the kitchen and stopped for a fraction of a second, just long enough to register that the room was warm, and someone had been in it before him, and then continued to the basin without comment. She set a cup at his end of the table. He sat down and opened the ledger, which she had left closed on the table the night before with her notes tucked inside, and he read through her additions in the same focused silence he brought to everything. The fence repair estimate was there. So was a revised supply order that eliminated the vendor overcharge she had found in the first week, and at the bottom, in her careful hand, a single line: "Vetch will come before November 1st. We should be ready." He read that line twice. "What kind of ready?" he said. "I've drafted a letter to the county clerk citing the survey discrepancy and formally contesting the lien," she said. "If Vetch files a formal claim before we contest it, the process becomes longer and more costly. If we file first, we control the timeline." He set the cup down. "You drafted a legal letter." "My first husband was a lawyer," she said. "I told you. You told me you kept his books." "I kept his books and read his library," she said, in the same measured tone she had used the first time. "The two together cover most situations." He looked at her with that expression again, the one she was beginning to catalog, the one that appeared each time she produced something he had not anticipated. It was not a comfortable expression for him. She could see that clearly. Elias Crane was a man who had organized his life around the premise that he required nothing from anyone, and each time she quietly disproved that premise, he had to do some internal work to accommodate the evidence. She did not make it easier for him. That was not her responsibility. "Let me read the letter," he said. She produced it from the back of the ledger. He read it slowly. She drank her coffee and looked out the window at the fence line they had repaired in the rain, which was, as he had predicted, holding. Beyond it, the lower pasture was still wet, the grass flattened in the direction the water had run, but the calves were visible at the far end, moving with the placid indifference of animals who have already forgotten the crisis that nearly took them. "There's a word here," he said. "Encumbrance. The clerk will know it. It is the correct legal term for what Vetch placed on the property. Yes, the clerk will know it." "All right." He set the letter down. "I'll write it in today. I'd like to come." He looked up. "Not for the clerk," she said. "I need to visit the mercantile. Mrs. Aldridge shortchanged the last supply delivery by 4 pounds of flour, and I intend to correct that." Something moved in his expression, not the reassessment she had seen before. Something smaller and, she thought, involuntary. The corner of his mouth moved in a direction that was not quite a smile, but was the shape a smile leaves behind on its way to somewhere else. "I'll have the wagon ready at 9, he said. Harlan Creek on a weekday morning had the particular social architecture of all small frontier towns. Everyone knew each other's business, and most of them had an opinion about it. Clara felt the town's attention on her the moment the wagon turned onto the main street. She had felt it on her wedding day, and on the Thursday, she had come with Elias to the clerk's office, but it was sharper now, more pointed, because a week had passed and the town had had time to form its narratives, and she had not yet had the opportunity to complicate them. She was aware of what those narratives likely were. A widow of no particular standing had married Elias Crane, who had no particular warmth and a ranch in considerable difficulty, and the charitable interpretation was that they had used each other, and the uncharitable one was that she had. She had heard the word said in Harlan Creek in reference to other women in her situation. Convenient, spoken with the particular intonation that made it mean something other than useful. She walked into Aldridge's mercantile with her invoice copy in her hand and her spine straight. Helen Aldridge was a large woman in her mid-50s who ran the store with the proprietary authority of someone who considered accurate accounting a personal insult. She looked at Clara over the counter with an expression of polite neutrality that was doing a great deal of work. "Mrs. Crane," she said, and the name still landed strangely, like a garment cut for someone else. "Mrs. Aldridge." Clara set the invoice on the counter and smoothed it flat. The delivery on the 14th included 4 pounds of flour short of the order total. "I'd like the balance credited against next month's account or delivered before the end of the week." A silence. Helen Aldridge looked at the invoice. She looked at Clara. "There may have been an error in the packing," she said carefully. "There was," Clara agreed. "I'm certain it was unintentional." She held the woman's gaze without aggression and without apology, and after a moment, Helen Aldridge wrote something in her ledger and said the flour would be delivered Thursday. "Thank you," Clara said, and picked up her invoice and turned toward the door. Elias was standing just inside it. She did not know how long he had been there. Long enough, she thought, from the way he stepped back to let her pass and fell into step beside her on the boardwalk without a word, close enough that their arms nearly touched. She did not move away. They walked back to the wagon in the October light, and Harlan Creek watched them go. And somewhere behind them, she heard the mercantile door close, and two women begin to speak in low voices, and she did not need to hear the words to know the narrative was already beginning to shift. Aldous Vetch arrived on a Tuesday, which Clara noted was deliberate. Tuesdays were when Cord rode the north pasture and Burris hauled feed from the storage barn, which meant the yard was empty and the house appeared undefended to anyone who had been watching the ranch's rhythms long enough to learn them. She had been watching those same rhythms herself, and the fact that Vetch had too told her something important about the kind of man he was. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horse. She did not go to the window immediately. She finished the column she was adding in the ledger, capped the ink, and then went to the window and looked out. He was not what she had constructed from the name and the numbers. She had imagined someone sharper, leaner, with the particular hungry look of men who take things through paperwork rather than labor. Aldous Vetch was broad and well-dressed in the manner of a man who has recently acquired money and not yet learned to wear it naturally. He rode a good horse badly. He dismounted at the post and looked at the house with the proprietary ease of someone who had already decided he owned more of it than the deed reflected. The door opened before he knocked. Clara had seen to that. "Mr. Vetch," she said. He looked at her with the brief recalibration men like him always performed when they encountered a woman where they had expected either a man or an obstacle. He settled on a smile. "Mrs. Crane," he said, "I was hoping to speak with your husband." "My husband is on the north pasture," she said. "I manage the accounts. You may speak with me." The smile adjusted itself. "This is a matter regarding the water diversion agreement, a financial arrangement between myself and the late Mr. Crane Sr. I wouldn't want to trouble you with the details." "The details are no trouble," Clara said. "I know them thoroughly. Please come in." He came in because refusing would have required an explanation he did not yet have prepared. She sat him at the kitchen table and set nothing before him. No coffee, no courtesy she had not decided to extend, and she placed the ledger on the table and opened it to the page where she had copied the relevant survey measurements in her precise hand. "The November payment," she said. "I understand you're expecting it." "That's right. Per the arrangement with Elias's father, there is no arrangement," she said, "not a written one. We have searched the property records and found no executed contract between your family and the Crane estate regarding water diversion rights or any related compensation." Vetch's smile did not disappear. It became a different kind of smile. "Now, Mrs. Crane, there are understandings between men that don't always make it onto paper. The county survey of 1878, she said, and turned the ledger to show him the measurements, places the South Creek boundary 14 feet east of your diversion structure. Your diversion does not cross Crane land. It never did. The basis for the lien does not exist." The smile was gone now. "A formal contest has already been filed with the county clerk," she continued, citing the survey registration number and the absence of any contractual agreement. "You will receive a copy by post within the week. Any further payment demands will be treated as harassment under territorial statute and recorded as such." Vetch looked at the page. He looked at her. He was doing the calculation she'd expected him to do. The calculation of whether she was bluffing, how much she actually knew, and whether Elias Crane was the kind of man who would back this woman's play or distance himself from it when pressed. She let him calculate. The kitchen was very quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, a horse moved in the yard, and a moment later she heard boots on the porch steps, unhurried, deliberate, the particular rhythm of a man who is not rushing because he does not need to. Elias came through the door and stopped. He looked at Vetch. He looked at Clara. He looked at the ledger open on the table and the stillness in the room that told him everything about what had been happening in it. He said nothing. He crossed to the stove, poured himself a cup of coffee, and leaned against the counter with his arms folded and his eyes on Vetch with an expression that was not threatening and did not need to be. Vetch stood. He was a man who understood when a room had turned against him, even when no one in it raised their voice. "I'll want to review this with my own records," he said. "Of course," Clara said. He left. She heard his horse leave the yard at a pace that was not quite dignified. She closed the ledger. Her hands were steady. She had made certain of that throughout. Elias set his coffee down. He looked at her with something she had not seen on him before, not the reassessment, not the reluctant surprise. This was simpler, and because it was simpler, harder to receive. It was plain and uncomplicated, and it sat on his face like a thing he had not decided to put there. "Clara," he said. She raised one hand slightly, the way you raise a hand to stop traffic on a road. "Don't," she said. Not unkindly. "I didn't do it for appreciation. I did it because that man had no right to what he was taking, and allowing him to continue served neither of us." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "I know why you did it," he said quietly. "That's not what I was going to say." She looked at him. He picked up his coffee and went back outside, and she stood in the kitchen in the thin afternoon light with the ledger closed under her hands and the sound of his boots fading across the porch. And she did not move for a long moment because she was not entirely certain what to do with the fact that her heart was beating harder than the situation warranted. "Now, before we go further, tell me something." Elias almost said her name like it meant something different this time. Clara almost let him. Do you think she should have let him finish? Because what comes next changes everything between them, and neither of them is ready for it. A week passed in the way weeks do when two people are carefully not looking at each other, in labor, in routine, in the deliberate filling of every quiet moment with something practical enough to explain the silence. Clara reorganized the supply pantry. She wrote a second letter to the county clerk following up on the contested lien. She repaired the kitchen curtain rod that had been missing its bracket since before she arrived, using a bent nail and a length of wire she found in the barn. And when she hung the curtains back, they caught the afternoon light in a way that changed the room entirely, made it look, for the first time, like a place someone intended to inhabit rather than merely endure. Elias did not comment on the curtains, but she caught him looking at them once, standing in the kitchen doorway with his coat still on and his hat in his hand, and the look on his face was the kind a man wears when something small has moved him, and he has not yet decided whether to be grateful or troubled by that fact. Cord noticed everything she was learning in the quiet, observant way of young men who have not yet learned to pretend they haven't seen what they've seen. He came to the kitchen door on Wednesday morning with a cracked harness strap and an expression of concentrated casualness. "Mr. Crane said you might know if we have spare leather in the storage room," he said. She did know. She had inventoried the storage room on her fourth day. She told him where to find it, and he thanked her, and then stood in the doorway a moment longer than the errand required. "Vetch was in town yesterday," he said, "at Fowler's Bank." She looked up from the ledger. "He was there a good while," Cord said. "Burris heard from the feed store man that Vetch came out looking like he'd swallowed something bad." "Good," she said. Cord almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." He paused. "People in town are talking, Mrs. Crane, about how you handled him. Mrs. Holt told Mrs. Aldridge, and Mrs. Aldridge told... Well, people are talking." Clara set her pen down. "What are they saying?" "That you're sharper than you look," he said simply, and had the grace to appear slightly embarrassed by how that landed. "I mean it as a compliment." "I know you do," she said. After he left, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table and considered what it meant that the town's narrative was shifting. Not because the approval mattered to her in the way it once might have, in the years when she had been young enough to need it. It mattered because a woman without standing in a frontier town was a woman without protection, and standing, she had learned, was built slowly and lost quickly and most easily maintained by being exactly and consistently what you appeared to be. No more, no less. She had been that. She intended to keep being that. Elias came in at midday with mud to the knee and a cut across the back of his left hand that he had wrapped in a strip of cloth that was already seeping through. He went to the basin. She was already at the shelf where she kept the medicine box before she had consciously decided to move. "Sit down," she said. He looked at the medicine box. He looked at her. "It's a scratch," he said. "It's deeper than a scratch, and the cloth you used is not clean," she said. "Sit down, please." A pause. He sat. She unwrapped the hand at the table and cleaned the cut with carbolic and water, working with the brisk efficiency she brought to all physical tasks, and he sat without protest, which told her more about the cut's depth than he had been willing to admit. His hand was large and rough-palmed, the knuckles scarred in the way of hands that have been doing hard work for 20 years, and she was aware of holding it with a steadiness she had to concentrate on maintaining. He was looking at her face while she worked. She knew it without looking up. Cord tells me Vetch was at the bank, he said. Yes. I suspect he was attempting to find a secondary avenue of pressure. Fowler won't give him one. The refinancing we filed last week closes that door. She tied off the clean bandage. You should keep this dry for 2 days. He looked at the bandage on his hand. Then he looked at her, and she had not moved back yet. And they were closer than they had been since the fence line in the rain, close enough that she could see the exact color of his eyes in the kitchen light, which was gray with a dark rim, the color of the sky the morning after a storm has passed. Clara, he said, and this time she did not raise her hand. I know, she said, quietly, without looking away. Neither of them moved. Outside, the wind crossed the yard in a long, low pass, and the curtains she had hung that morning shifted in the draft from the window, and the kitchen was very still around the two of them, and the only sound was the stove, and the distant sound of cord moving in the barn, and the particular silence of two people standing at the edge of something neither of them had planned to reach. He closed his hand, the bandaged one, slowly, carefully, as though testing whether the thing she had built would hold. It held. Vetch made his final move on a Friday, which was Margaret Holt's day at the house, which meant there was a witness. He did not come to the ranch this time. He filed a counterclaim with the county clerk alleging that Clara's contested lien letter had been submitted fraudulently, that she lacked the legal standing to act on behalf of the Crane property without a notarized power of attorney, and that the survey measurements she had cited were taken from a superseded document. It was a narrow argument and a largely fabricated one, but it was filed correctly, and it carried a court date, and a court date meant costs, and costs on top of the bank refinancing meant the kind of pressure that could still break what she had been carefully building. The clerk's notice arrived by post that afternoon. Clara read it at the kitchen table, while Margaret Holt moved quietly around the washing basin, pretending not to watch. She read it twice. Then she set it down and was still for a moment in the particular way she was still when she was thinking hard, not vacant, not uncertain, but concentrated, the way a lens concentrates light into a single point before it burns. Bad news, Margaret said. A complication, Clara said. Not the same thing. She went to the storage trunk in the east bedroom, where she kept the documents she had brought from Harlan Creek, the papers from Thomas Whitfield's estate, the letters, and at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, a slim volume of territorial property statutes she had taken from her late husband's library, because she had known even then that knowledge was the only inheritance that could not be repossessed. She found what she needed on page 43. A wife's signature on property documents filed jointly with her husband required no separate power of attorney under the 1879 Territorial Homestead Act. The marriage itself conferred standing. Vetch's counterclaim rested on a legal premise that had been explicitly resolved 4 years before he filed it. Either his attorney was incompetent, or he was counting on Elias Crane not having someone in his house who owned a copy of the relevant statute. He had miscalculated that. She copied the citation, wrote a 1-page response to the counterclaim, and had it ready by the time Elias came in at dusk. She set it on the table beside his plate, without preamble. He read it standing up, still in his coat, and she watched him read it the way she had learned to watch him, not directly, but from the edge of her attention, enough to register the moment his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, the particular release of a man who has been braced for a blow that did not land. He set the paper down. "You had this book," he said. "You brought it with you." "I brought several books," she said. "That one in particular I have carried for 4 years because I had a feeling it would be useful eventually." He looked at her with the full attention he rarely gave anything that was not the land or the herd, direct and unhurried, and without the careful management she had come to recognize as his default expression around her. "You came here prepared," he said. "Not an accusation. Something closer to wonder." "I came here with what I had," she said. "I always do." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the kitchen held them both in its wood-smoke warmth with the lamplight low and the sound of Margaret Holt finishing in the next room and preparing to leave. "I told myself," Elias said slowly, "when I went to the preacher. I told myself it was the land, that I needed the signature and the arrangement and nothing else." Clara looked at him. "I know what you told yourself," she said. "I told myself the same things." And now? The question sat between them, plain and undecorated, the way all his important questions were, no performance around it, no retreat already prepared. He was a man asking a real question and waiting for a real answer, and that alone was enough to make her chest tighten with something that was not fear, though it lived in the same neighborhood. Now, she said carefully, I think the land had its own intentions. Something in him settled. Not relaxed, Elias Crane did not relax, she suspected, even in sleep, but settled, the way a thing settles when it has found the ground it was looking for. He reached across the table and set his hand over hers, the bandaged one, still healing. She felt the warmth of it through her skin and did not pull away and did not pretend the warmth was not there. Outside, Margaret Holt said goodnight from the doorway and closed the front door quietly behind her, with the tact of a woman who understood exactly what she was leaving behind her, and the ranch was theirs and the evening was theirs, and the silence between them had changed entirely. It was no longer the silence of two people enduring proximity, but the silence of two people who have stopped pretending they are not exactly where they chose to be. The counterclaim was dismissed on a Wednesday morning in early November, 9 days after Clara filed the statutory response. The county clerk wrote the dismissal in 3 sentences and charged Vetch the filing costs, which was not justice exactly, but was the shape justice takes in a frontier town when it arrives at all. Elias rode to town to collect the notice himself, and when he came back he set the paper on the kitchen table without ceremony and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and the pale winter light coming in flat and clean behind him. Clara read the notice. She set it down. It's done, she said. It's done, he agreed. She had expected relief. She found instead that what moved through her was quieter than relief, something closer to the feeling of setting down a weight you have carried so long you had forgotten it was not part of your own body. The Vetch lien was gone. The bank refinancing had been accepted 2 weeks prior, the terms reasonable. The December deadline met with $40 to spare from the recovered overpayments. The eastern acreage was clear. The herd had come through the autumn with losses lower than the previous 2 years combined. The ranch was not prosperous, but it was no longer dying. She had done that. They had done that. Elias came to the table and sat down across from her, and she noticed he had not gone back out to the yard, which was unusual for this hour, and he was still holding his hat, turning it once in his hands with the focused attention of a man organizing what he intends to say. She waited. I have not been easy to be around, he said. No, she agreed. I made an arrangement because I needed a signature and a steady hand on the books, and I told myself that was sufficient and that I didn't require anything beyond it. I remember. I was wrong about that. He set the hat down. He looked at her directly, the way he had learned to look at her, without the management, without the careful distance he had maintained for the first weeks, as though proximity were a debt he couldn't afford. I was wrong about most of what I told myself before you came. Clara looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked at him. Elias, she said. His name in her mouth was still careful, still something she spent rather than scattered. I came here with nothing I was willing to risk again. I had decided that thoroughly. I know you had. I watched you, she said quietly. I watched you work this land that was breaking you and refused to let it see you break. And I watched you leave coffee made every morning before I came downstairs, and I watched you step in front of me in that mercantile without announcing it and act as though you hadn't done anything at all. She paused. I watched you do small things that cost you something, and I could not make myself stop watching. His jaw moved once. I would like, he said carefully, for this to be a real marriage. Not the arrangement. The other thing. The kitchen was very still. The stove burned low and steady. Through the window, the November plains stretched out flat and pale under a sky the color of worn denim, and the windmill turned at its unhurried pace, and somewhere in the barn, Hector was sleeping in the straw with the philosophical contentment of a creature that had always known how this would end. Clara looked at Elias Crane, at the mended cuff and the weathered face, and the hands that had held fence wire in the rain beside hers, and the gray eyes that had never once looked at her with anything less than the full weight of his attention, and she felt the last carefully maintained distance inside her chest, close like a door swinging shut on an empty room that no longer needed to be kept. "All right," she said, not with performance, not with the trembling declaration of someone who has been waiting for rescue, with the plain and deliberate voice of a woman who has assessed the ground, found it solid, and chosen to stand on it. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. Outside, the wind moved through the yard in a long, easy pass, and the curtains she had hung in the kitchen caught the last of the afternoon light and held it, and the Crane Ranch sat on its high ground, above the plains in the early winter quiet, weathered and mended and still standing, the way things stand when two people have decided, without ceremony and without performance, that the holding is worth the cost.